Today on the Kuvio Caller.
The whole productivity side of things is a big challenge for remote workers. It's hard to keep yourself productive in a home environment, especially if you're working from somewhere like a bedroom.
I chat with Kieran Parker, Kuvio's Director of Design, on our experiences with productivity and motivation as we've progressed from our traditional careers into remote positions.
Hey guys, this is Joseph Young. I'm the founder and CEO of Kuvio Creative, and welcome to episode 2 of the Kuvio Caller. I'm here with Kieran Parker, our Director of Design, and this podcast will be talking about productivity and motivation. We've been talking a little bit over the past few days about it and the differences of kind of where we started productivity-wise as just developers and designers, and kind of how that's more as we've become kind of more directors and my job as a CEO and tackling more projects at once, and how the whole thing has kind of flowed. Has been really interesting, and so we thought we'd share some of those ideas with you guys.
Maybe it's worth starting with our initial struggles, right? So, for example, the whole productivity side of things is a big challenge for remote workers. It's hard to keep yourself productive in a home environment, especially if you're working from somewhere like a bedroom, where a bed or a TV is just across the room from you. I know for me, productivity, especially when I was in my bedroom, was very hard, and I found that when I'd moved into my first flat, that having a room dedicated as an office, it doesn't have to be an office room, it can be a room that's used for something else, but is away from your bedroom or your front room. It really helped me get in that productive mind zone every day. You know, I'd get up, get ready as if I was about to walk out to work, and I'd just go into a different room where my PC was set up. And it kind of just, it just made that switch in my head. It didn't feel really any different, but you start to associate that room as a work room, the same way that you're not supposed to watch TV in bed, because it then associates your mind with watching TV instead of sleeping in that place. That's something that worked for me earlier on. I'm not sure if you've ever had that experience, or if you just had an office from day one. I'm not sure.
Well, it's interesting because it's almost like there's something psychological to that commute, right? I mean, it's what most people who are not remote workers go through every single day, 5 days a week, right? Is get up, get ready, make yourself presentable, then get in the car and drive anywhere from 10 minutes to an hour or more. Mm-hmm. And then show up at your workplace, and then now that you're at your workplace for the next 8 to 10 hours, you're in work mode, right? Mm-hmm. And to be honest, so I spent, before I started Kuvio, I spent about 5 years at 2 different jobs working at a place that was an hour drive both ways every day. The first place that I worked was a little bit more lax, but then the second place that I worked was, I would wake up at 7 o'clock in the morning and then drive right in the middle of rush hour from 8 to 9, get there somewhere around 9. But then, there'd be times I'd be there until 7 p.m., then drive an hour back. And so it ended up with what essentially was an 11-hour workday, right? Minus the time to get dressed and do all the normal stuff and eat and all those kind of things. But it did do one thing, right? That 1 hour of commute kind of shifted my mind into work mode, and then the hour commuting back shifted it back into kind of living your life mode. Mm-hmm. And there are pros and cons to that, because I always felt like by the time I got home, I was ready to just, either crash and do Netflix for 3 hours, right? Or whatever back then. But at least by the time that I walked in the door, I'd kind of left work where work was, which was a nice separation. But the con of that is that it's almost too separated, because you end up having to be in work mode specifically from 9 to 5, right? And you end up having to be in, play mode or whatever from 6 p.m. on or whatever. And so this schedule is kind of dictated, whereas kind of in the creative professions like both you and I are in, we both know that just it doesn't work that way, right? So there's this constant weighing of that pro and con of being forced into a schedule like that versus just the whims of our sort of when our brains decide to tell us something interesting about some project that we've got, and the more that disconnected those are, the harder it is to break into that mode if it's 3 o'clock in the morning and all of a sudden you have this bright idea, right? But also, if your computer is sitting right next to your bed, then that also has its pros and cons as well, like yours.
Yeah. There's I had a similar thing, which was getting the bus every day, taking an hour trip to work, and then an hour trip. This was in university. This was sort of the ideal job. Like, it was for a really well-known design agency, really well-known like position, stuff like that, great clients, and it was a good place to work. I loved the people there. It was, the work was good, but it was for me, the hour commute there and the hour commute back on a bus, which I think I worked there for like 2 weeks, and the bus was on time maybe 3 times. One time I finished at 5 and it didn't turn up till 9 p.m, which was the worst day. For me, that sort of commute, I think, was too much. My mind was never... I didn't like long days. I felt mentally exhausted. I didn't feel like I had enough rest by the next day and stuff like that, which is, I think, where the motivation of remote work has helped me. I left that job 2 weeks into it because I realized it wasn't for me and started freelancing right away. And I think even though I had no clients, I had bills coming up and all that, and no money, I was happier than making a good wage, a typical day job, because I could work, when I wanted, how I wanted. If I had a spark of creativity in the middle of the night, I could get up and work on it, even if it was only for my own projects at the start. Actually thinking about it, just yesterday, so we've had over here in the UK 2 really hot days randomly in the middle of February. It's cold again now, but yesterday it's one of those days where it's hot and everyone's going to work saying they wish they could sit in the sunshine and they wish they didn't have to go to work. Well, I was sat in my office and I was looking sort of at my screen trying to do work, but it felt like I'd been sat there for hours and I hadn't got anything done. So my partner was actually off yesterday and I asked if she just wanted to go for a walkabout. So we went for a random walk around the town for about 25 minutes. Came back, done an hour or 2 of work, realised I still wasn't really doing any work. So we went for another 30 or 40 minute walk. Came back, done another hour. And I was like, this just is not working today.
Yeah.
So I ended up just calling it off early. I think I finished about 4:45. Normally I finish about 5 or 6. And the thing is, like you said, there's not a hard distinction between finish and not finish when you're working from home anyway, because I was still messaging people on Slack. I think I came back on the PC about midnight and I was talking to some people on Slack about midnight about stuff. And then I can make up that time, whether it's adding an hour or probably working Saturday, because my partner works on Saturday, so I'll have time to myself to work then. But yeah, the whole motivation thing and productivity is kind of hard to get into, and I think you either have it or you don't have it, because there's a lot of remote workers. I know Rhonda goes to coffee shops, right, to work, because that's just how she works best. And I think it's important for anyone working either at home or just not in a typical office to find what works best for them. They might work best in their bedroom. I don't know. Maybe they like the idea of being able to walk 2 seconds and have a quick 10-minute nap.
Yeah, I mean that's her motivation, right? Is she likes being surrounded sometimes by people, not necessarily talking to them, but having that sort of energy around her, so that she can, and that is also away from her home, so that she can do that disconnection and kind of get into work mode, and that's her way to do it. But that's just a walk down the street, right, to a coffee shop, versus a rush hour commute or an hour on the bus or whatever. It's interesting because I feel like as people get used to 100% remote work, this particular thing is one of the most primary weirdnesses that they have to kind of deal with themselves, and everybody ends up dealing with it in their own way, which I think is beautiful. I mean, we have people that are still sticking to kind of a traditional 9 to 5, but they're doing it because they want to do it, not because that's what our work hours are. There are people that work at 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the morning their time, because that's what they want to do, or that's when they have the idea, that's when they have the motivation or the energy to do it, right? There are people that just every single day they're changing, right? They might work 14 hours one day and then work 0 hours for the next 4 days and then work another 14 hours and then, and there's no pattern whatsoever in it. But I think that's beautiful. And I've always had this theory that I can't really prove myself because I only have my own personal experience, right? But I've always felt like if we lived in a world where we were able to listen to our own brains and our own bodies and react appropriately to them and let ourselves tell ourselves when we were in the mood to work, versus trying to trick ourselves with all these psychological tricks into getting into the mood to work, which typically is because it's work hours, right? Because, oh my gosh, I just showed up for work and now I need to get through this 8-hour day because I've got to find 8 hours of work to do, right? But if somehow we were all able to just work on our own schedules, what I've noticed, at least personally, is if I let that happen, it actually does happen. And when it does happen, it feels so much better to be able to sit down and work when my brain is ready to work, versus being promptly ready to go at 9 a.m. and trying to trick my brain into being ready to go and ready to be creative promptly at 9 a.m. every day.
Well, I think you're right, but I think there's a slippery slope. So there's obviously times when you just feel like you're not in the mood to work. As a designer, a lot of the time you might face like mental or creative block. And then the problem is you'll say, on a Monday, I might be like, oh, I'm just not feeling it today, I'll do it tomorrow. And then I might get mental block again tomorrow and try the next day, and I might do 2 hours and have it again. I think the problem is not using it as an excuse and understanding when mental block is actually mental block, and when what you're assuming is mental block is actually just a slight bit of procrastination or something sort of sneaking in. I can't remember who it was. So I'm not even going to try and guess, but there was someone who's very well known, I think, in a design niche, who said there's no such thing as a creative block, because if you have creative block, the best thing to do would just to try and be creative in either that way or another way. So for example, if I'm trying to do a logo and I just have no ideas coming to me, I have no idea what I'm doing, I just feel like I can't do anything, the best way to get over that is to look at inspiration, to draw random sketches. They don't have to mean anything or try and solve the solution you're after, but the point is you're almost forcing yourself through that creative block by inspiring yourself to do it, right? In the same way, if you're looking to work out or something, you read motivating quotes, or you look at people who are maybe a bit more of the body shape you're looking for. I know there's a subreddit called Motivation that I subscribe to, which comes up with these quotes and stuff. It's the same thing for doing work. If you want to do the work that you're trying to do, sometimes you just have to force yourself to get into the mood. And a lot of the time, once you've started something and you're 30 minutes in, you don't even realize that you're now into the working mood. You've kind of tricked your mind to do the work, but it's hard, because sometimes it is just actually hard to get into the work. So you just need to know when what days to call it quits and what days to just push through it.
Yeah, you're totally right. I mean, it's not. It's there. There's a book that I read a long time ago that still sticks in my mind called Flow, that is specifically about essentially that zone that you get in where time just loses all meaning and you blink and then it's 6 hours later and you've been working on the same thing because you're 100% focused on it and you're in that sort of state of flow. But it's also talking about how to reach that state of flow and about all of the different interruptions that can happen and how psychologically kind of our brains work to get into that state. And you're totally right. Like that's the other end of that spectrum, is that if you can trick yourself, if there is a way to trick yourself to get into that flow, and if you do sit down and just start on it, right? Or like you said, start on something different that is sort of in the same sphere as it, but totally unrelated to it, that just gets you going. Then if you can end up in that flow, then that act of tricking yourself may, in a lot of cases, actually be fruitful, right? And so it's such a hard kind of thing to balance, because it's hard to know how much you should trust the feelings that your brain is giving you, and because the feeling is, like, for me, the feeling that my brain gives me for creative block and for just not being in the mood to work are very similar.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's the same for you, but it's very hard to distinguish between those, and so I tend to just relegate it to, okay, let's let my subconscious think for a while, and hopefully it'll come up with an answer that will give me the motivation to start actually working on it.
So there is that. There's the times when I don't know what the difference is, but I think it's also the easiest way to try and get to the source of what's causing that feeling is to ask what you've been doing recently that's stopping you, right? So, for example, if we're about to start this huge project, I'll put it off for a while because my mind's telling me, like, oh, you're not ready. Where I am, I just need to start, but because it's such a big, like, it's almost like a big wall that I've just got to kind of start climbing, But my mind's like, no, you're not in the right mind space to start doing that yet,
Well, isn't there a finding that I have no idea who came up with it, but that essentially our brains can only handle 7, I think the number is 7 plus or minus 2 simultaneous kind of parallel thoughts, right, or pathways at once. And so you get the kind of it's why we can remember phone numbers well, because phone numbers are chunked into 2 or 3 sets of numbers that then become 2 or 3 things in our brain. But if we're forced to memorize 10 digits that are just random digits that we don't put into phone number format, then it's much harder for us to memorize them because there's no chunking of that data. And so that's one thing that I've noticed as we've had more and more projects that we've taken on. The sheer initial requirement of getting myself into the zone of an entirely different project than the one that I was thinking about 15 minutes ago is one of the most brutal things. It's so brutal because especially if I've been in the zone in one project, there's an entire sort of reboot that has to occur because there's so much context around an entirely different project that has to then be absorbed and rethought about and brought from the sort of abyss of our brains to really be able to approach the second project in a decent enough way and be able to make decisions about it in a good way. That's one of the things I've struggled with for years now.
Yeah, that's something I do as well, which is break down big tasks into small tasks, and then those small tasks into smaller tasks. We obviously do that on the backlog anyway for Kuvio, but sometimes I find that writing them down in my little notebook that's always on my desk helps. Even though it's on the screen, it helps to just have it in front of me in super micro scale tasks, and then also ticking them off physically releases like a hit of dopamine, right? So you're just like, oh, now I can get on to the next one and the next one. And the smaller you can chunk the tasks into, if each task takes you 10 minutes, so that means you're going to get, a hit of that good feeling every 10 minutes per task, you'll be on this sort of